The first speaker for the evening is Dr. John Brantner, clinical psychologist and full professor as of July at the University of Minnesota, who will be speaking on the overview of the Transcendental Experience. He spoke at the second benefit last year, and a very unusual thing happened. Not only did he speak in our attempt to raise some money, he made a sizable donation when he came by the ticket counter. It's the first time, and probably the only time, we'll ever see a speaker's honorarium flowing in that kind of direction. We appreciate his friendship and his appearance here this evening. Dr. Brantner.
As Cal said in the small film clip that you saw, there are glimpses of things beyond. We are seeing these increasingly in these days. We're becoming increasingly interested in them. We're beginning to try to talk about them for the first time in a long time. There are things, as Dr. Sibley will tell you later, beyond experience, beyond the senses. One of the troubles is that it's very hard to talk about them. There are a number of difficulties in talking about the transcendental experience. And some of the greatest of the difficulties that are involved here concern language and words. In our society, we've not been taught to recognize or consider or discuss these experiences. We don't have a vocabulary in which to express these concepts. And secondly, where vocabulary does exist, it is so embedded in the context of one or another of the organized religions that the words used to describe the experience produce in many people scorn or revulsion that closes off some avenues to accomplished awareness, to practice, to experience, as though we refused to walk through a door that was painted a certain color or that was carved with a certain symbol. We close ourselves off because of language. And then, of course, there's very good evidence that some aspects of the transcendental experience are by their very nature inexpressible in our ordinary language of words and syntax. So we'll have trouble. I shall have trouble, you'll have trouble later on this evening in talking about this kind of thing. Also, it's very difficult in today's society to talk about it. Peter Berger, in his recent book on modern man and the supernatural, which he called Rumors of Angels, Peter Berger suggests that modern man and supernature have drawn apart, widely apart, and that no one who has experienced in supernature, religionist, mystic, theologian, no one can speak with assurance now to modern man. All we can hear, Peter Berger says, are rumors of angels, hints and suggestions that maybe there is something beyond the everyday, practical, objective world of our senses and our science. That's what I shall offer you tonight. Rumors and hints of something that perhaps some in today's world might choose to explore. Reference, casual reference, to a host of antique maps, old guides, left by people who have at least, as one mystic put it, visited the coasts of the country. I'll focus on two rumors tonight. The first, there are increasing rumblings that suggest that something is happening in our experience. There is, as all of you know, an increased interest in the Eastern religions and the Eastern mysticisms and the Eastern practices. There is quite a bit of the more than a little bit dangerous interest in witchcraft and divinations and foretellings, in spiritualism and demonology. A more direct courting of a wider danger that I'll come back to later. There is the widespread disenchantment in our society today with the practical, technological, positivistic, purely scientific approach to the world and to life. Reich summed this up in what must be one of the most perceptive passages in his recent book, in speaking of the central stream of consciousness in our culture today. He said, the man in this state of consciousness is the victim of a cruel deception. He has been persuaded that the richness, the satisfactions, the joys of life are to be found in power, success, status, acceptance, popularity, achievements, rewards, and the rational, competent mind. He wants nothing to do with dread, awe, wonder, mystery, accidents, failure, helplessness, magic. He has been deprived of the search for self that only these experiences make possible. And he has produced a society that is the image of his own alienation and impoverishment. Perhaps in our new perception of our own alienation and impoverishment, we are beginning to look, only as rumors, look at the lives and practices of human beings whose lives were not alienated and impoverished. If we do this, we may be surprised. We shall surely and certainly be changed, transformed. The second rumor is, of course, the marked rise in the entire world in the use of intoxicants. In the use of intoxicants not as a pleasant adjunct to social entertainment, not as the means to alleviate intolerable conditions of life, not as an expression of immature defiance and rebellion, not as a consequence of physiological addiction, not as a tranquilizer for mental illness, but an increased use of intoxicants with the frank and open admission that intoxication is the goal. The peak, the high, the trip, the drunk. An increased seeking after these experiences. And along with this, the curious illumination that can come from a study not of users. Why do men drink? Why do men use drugs? But turning the question round, since roughly 85% of us in the world are users of intoxicants, what's wrong with those who don't? Turning it round and studying the small minority of non-users of intoxicants and the tiny handful of ex-users. Those who, through frankly spiritual programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, Synanon, have gone beyond their addictions. When you look at it this way, you see that all of the drinkers, all of the eaters of drugs are looking for something, and looking for something which the non-users have found. They are trying to solve a very real and very honorable problem in their lives, which the non-users and the ex-users have solved. I believe with considerable evidence, at least evidence of one sort, that the experience which is variously called consciousness expanding, peak, high, mystic, ecstatic, transcendental, that this experience underlies the attractiveness of intoxication, and that this experience deserves our fullest attention, not only in its chemically induced forms, but also in its spontaneous, or normal, or practiced, or veridical forms. And we might look at some of the evidence. Some of the best comes from William James, who was deeply interested in the transcendental experience and also deeply interested in intoxication. Writing in the Varieties of Religious Experience about drunkenness, James gave 100 years ago a kind of insight into drunkenness that few of us, even those who work closely in the field of alcoholism, that few of us maintain. People drink for a positive reason. James said, sobriety diminishes, discriminates, and says no. Drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes. Drunkenness is, in fact, the great exciter of the yes function in men. It brings its votary from the chill periphery of things to the radiant core. It makes him, for the moment, one with the truth. Not through mere perversity do men run after it. It is part of the deeper mystery and tragedy of life that whiffs and gleams of something that we all immediately recognize as excellent, should be vouchsafed to so many of us only in the fleeting earlier phases of what, in its totality, is so degrading a poison. Drunkenness is the great exciter of the yes function in man. William Bolitho put it another way. He said, the shortest way out of the city of Manchester is a bottle of Gordon's gin. It is. Oliver Wendell Holmes, our own Oliver Wendell Holmes, at the time when ether was introduced into our society. Besides its great alleviation of pain, ether was also seen as a social intoxicant. Ether parties were arranged. People would sit round a table and uncork a bottle of ether and all breathe deeply. It was during one of these parties that Oliver Wendell Holmes had a very revealing experience, revealing in several ways, about the nature of chemically induced intoxication. As he was coming out of his coma, his ether coma, Holmes was seen to make a kind of scrabbling motion on his chest. And when he came out, people said, "What were you doing?" And he said, "Fools, I had condensed the whole of human philosophy into a single sentence, and I was trying to write it down. And now I've lost it." And he insisted that they intoxicate him again. They sent him back into a deep ether coma. While he was under, he made the scrabbling motion. They quickly put a piece of paper under it, gave him a pencil, and he wrote madly for a moment. When he came out, all of them were anxious to see this tremendous condensation of the whole of human philosophy into a single sentence. If any of you have had the ether experience, you'll understand. His sentence was, "My God, what a stench." William James, with a great deal more introspective attention to what was happening, did the same thing himself on repeated occasions with nitrous oxide, laughing gas. This was even a more delightful social intoxicant, as you can imagine. And there were nitrous oxide parties frequently. James became, it was at the time when he was deeply immersed in Hegelian philosophy, the reconciliation of opposites and this kind of thing. And James, on many occasions, intoxicated himself with nitrous oxide and reports on the experience. He said, "With me, as with every other person of whom I have heard, the keynote of the experience is the tremendously exciting sense of an intense metaphysical illumination. Truth lies open to the view in depth beneath depth of almost blinding evidence. The mind sees all the logical relations of being with an apparent subtlety and instantaneity to which the normal consciousness offers no parallel. Only as sobriety returns, the feeling of insight fades, and one is left staring vacantly at a few disjointed words and phrases, as one stares at a cadaverous-looking snow peak from which the sunset glow has just fled, or at the black cinder left by an extinguished brand." James, too, recorded a lot of his intense metaphysical illuminations under nitrous oxide intoxication. He said, "I have sheet after sheet of phrases dictated or written during the intoxication, which to the sober reader seem meaningless drivel, but which at the moment of transcribing were fused in the fire of infinite rationality." Some examples. What's mistake but a kind of take? What's nausea but a kind of ausea? Sober, drunk, unk, astonishment. Agreement, disagreement, exclamation point. Emotion, motion. By God, how that hurts. By God, how it doesn't hurt. Reconciliation of two extremes. By George, nothing but nothing. Medical school, divinity school, 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 oh my God, oh God, oh God. He went on to say, "The most coherent and articulate sentence which I wrote under nitrous oxide intoxication was this." If any of you scrawled notes while you were drunk or otherwise intoxicated, it strikes a beautifully reminiscent tone. "There are no differences, but differences of degree between different degrees of difference and no difference." But many people have witnessed and testified to the intense metaphysical illumination beyond the world of reality, beyond the senses, that accompanies intoxication, especially to the person who is insightful into this. Emily Dickinson frequently referred to it in her poetry. "I taste the liquor." She also was able to achieve this without the chemical induction. "I taste a liquor never brewed from tankards scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the Rhine yield such an alcohol. Inebriative air am I. inebriative air. In another of her poems, she said, the moderate drinker of delight does not deserve the spring. And then the deep insight of juleps, part are in the jug, but more are in the joy. Of juleps, part are in the jug, but more are in the joy. Recently, I undertook to convince a group of hard-headed, practical medical students that they had all experienced ecstasy, the Transcendental Experience. It wasn't difficult at all, just a little bit of talking. They had never, most of them, like most of us in our society, never tried any insight into what this is, simply accept it as a delight, as a joy when it comes. Some of them experienced it in music, performing, better than they'd ever performed before at the keyboard. One in theatricals, another in athletic performance. One reported the common experience of suddenly having a perfect day transformed into a transcendent day, in which familiar sights become unfamiliar, the quality of the light changes for a few seconds. People in other traditions call these glimpses of paradise. We always perceive this kind of experience in terms of our expectations and our past experience. A transformation of reality. Some experience it in love. Cal Appleby referred to the glimpses of something beyond that occur in relationship, in community, in getting into the lives of others. All of these things will set this experience off. And it is transcendent. It goes beyond the limits. It goes beyond the limits of perception. We see things as we have never seen them before, and we see them with an intense conviction that this is what they are really like. And we are left with a feeling of sadness when they transform back into the sooty, gray city that we know, when for a moment it was transformed into the one abiding city. They are transcendent in performance. We do exceed our limits at times in performance. We do run faster than we have ever run or ever will again. We do, once or twice perhaps in our life at the keyboard, play with the full use of 10 fingers, and then we go back to playing with 6. We do transcend ourselves. And we do transcend ourselves in our awareness of self, the deeply illuminating insight that accompanies these. These experiences do happen to the untrained. They do come as a kind of, as Ileana of Romania calls them, infused virtue. Not sought for, but simply infused. Not acquired, simply infused. And they do occur. But we are not trained in our society even to recognize them, or to talk about them, or to share them. We all have. We all experience the mystic experience. But they occur much more often to people, mostly in our society until recently, of a religious background, but people who are trained and practiced in prayer, in meditation, in exercise of contemplation, in disciplined practices intended to intensify and increase these experiences. Disciplined and informed perhaps by one of the great traditions, the Western traditions, of which there are many, or the Eastern traditions. Disciplined and informed perhaps by one of the great manuals, John of the Cross, the Cloud of Unknowing, Raleigh and Lady Julian, the great tradition of the English mystics, now dead. The tradition is dead. The great tradition of the Jewish mystics, the Indian mystics, the Japanese mystics. And in this practice, using silence, and especially the difficult achievement of interior silence, using posture, deliberate attention and control of posture, isolation, sleeplessness, vigils, hunger through fastings, concentration, and the extraordinarily difficult sense of emptying, the hardest of all to achieve, using all of the techniques described by people who have been to the coasts of that country. And to experience then the going beyond self into an intensification of experience that is beyond words, perception that goes beyond the senses, force that exceeds the physical limits, and above all, a transcendent conviction of unity that shatters isolation and alienation and destroys meaninglessness. and which incidentally shows the accidental, trivial, and unimportant nature of the specific language, the specific exercises, the specific tradition in which one is practicing this, the specific concepts that are used in the achievement of this experience. The important thing is reaching the coast of that country. And once beached, it is no longer of the slightest importance whether we arrived, in Ileana of Romania's words, by rowboat or by sailboat. Whether we swam by our own efforts, were transported miraculously by a stone on a stone boat. Whether we went in company in a steamship, or whether we floated by ourselves in an old inner tube. The means of reaching this state, the coasts of that country, are unimportant. And I could leave it at this point, accepting that this leaves unresolved the element that I referred to before, the certain element of danger, of risk. There are two aspects of this that I'd like to talk about just briefly. The relationship between madness and the mystic experience. We tend to get hung up on this. Was Joan of Arc really a paranoid schizophrenic? And there is no way in the language of science and the language of psychiatry that you can demonstrate to me that she was not. The relationship between madness and ecstasy. What if somebody says man can directly perceive the living spirit of eternity? Is he mad? Or is he reporting experience? It was Carl Jung who said that. So he's not mad. It's okay, I suppose, if someone says, I am attuned to God. I experienced directly the unity of all things, God and man, material and immaterial, time-bound and timeless, and so on. Or I have become immersed, undone, unselfed, plunged into oneness. That's still okay. What if somebody tells you, I saw Christ in a glory of light, tossing a little nut in his hand, and the nut was the world? That was Lady Julian of Norwich. So she's not mad. What if somebody says, I was in a Chinese restaurant, and suddenly everything was changed. Even the wonton soup sparkled. That was one of the earliest experiences of LSD in a perfectly sane person. What if somebody tells you, I was sitting in a clearing and the very light was changed. It was unlike any sunlight I had ever seen in my life. The air was different, clearer and cleaner, almost palpable, as though the clearing had been preserved in pure crystal. This was a patient of mine, but my ears pricked up with what he said next. And I saw how male and female were one dancing reality, with 7 and 5 and the dark star coming nearer. What's the difference between saying, I was united with God, I was one with God, and I am God? Or when someone says, as a patient said to me, not a patient, might have been, do you believe me when I tell you that God took us and transported us through the open air to Mars and the other planets, and we talked with the people there? I could argue, I think with some conviction, that the same experience, shaking, unexpected, unprepared for, unsought, underlies all of these reports, and that this experience will be perceived and reported in the closest, and I would insist in nearly accidental terms. That what we perceive, and especially what we report, under the influx of ecstasy, will be entirely expressed in terms of our past experience and our expectations. Imagine, if you will, a sudden, overwhelming focusing of mystery and numinousness at the end of your kitchen. This will be seen, of course, by some, on the basis of their expectation and past experience, as the Archangel Michael sitting on the kitchen stove. It will be seen by others as proof of their fearfully anticipated madness. By others, perhaps like Florida Scott Maxwell, the age of 84, It will be experienced as a delightful high, with the tea kettle almost literally singing on the stove, with the stove knobs twinkling like stars, and with herself, 84 years old, dancing round the kitchen while she waits for the kettle to boil. The same experience underlying all of these will be perceived in the terms of madness, of delight, as a high, as a deep religious experience in terms of what we have known before. This phenomenon, this concentration of numinousness, this collecting of mystery, of holiness, if you want, has been reported since man has kept records, and we are still unable to distinguish it from mental illness. Perhaps the primitive sensibility comes close. Perhaps the mad have been touched by God. But there is another danger, and a risk which is well known to theologians, mystics, guides, gurus. The danger and the risk which is perhaps little credited by scientists. Daniel Berger, writing on the dark night of the soul, one of the greatest guides to the mystic experience, speaking of John of the Cross, said no. Well, he went on to say, regarding the man's life and his writings, he said, are we to seize on his life as another loose-jointed excuse for personal adventuring, rootlessness, irresponsibility toward those near and far? No. John opened before us another way, a precious and neglected truth, the inescapable paradoxes, the burning dialectic of truth, the high wire acts required of the mind that would be not in possession of, but possessed by the truth, in passage and in danger. In passage and in danger. Perhaps here we are opening ourselves, exposing ourselves to all of the powers of the universe. Perhaps here our sanity-preserving illusions do fall away, and this is dangerous. Buckminster Fuller has told us again and again that if science teaches us anything, it teaches us that there are no straight lines, no flat surfaces, and no solids anywhere in the universe. And if we really perceive that, we are in danger. We are in danger. Perhaps there is light and darkness at the center of experience. And perhaps we expose ourselves as we seek pure light to all of the swirling powers of darkness. Unarmed, unprepared, moved perhaps by careless curiosity or by idle discontent, by negativistic rebellion, by thoughtless conformity to our first and perhaps overwhelming awareness of silly self in the immensity of chaos, bathed in the ineffable light of eternity. It should follow that I do not see this as a thing for children. It should follow that I do not advise the chemical intensification of this experience or the drug acceleration of this process. I have a hearty and humble appreciation of the slightest approach to the transcendental experience. I stand awed myself before those who have progressed anywhere beyond the kindergarten in this growth and in this search, in this journey. For it always has visible consequences, and it always results in transformation. Again, he uses his own language. But listen to Auden on prayer. He was reviewing Eiseley's last book. More importantly, Eiseley reveals himself as a man unusually well trained in the habits of prayer, by which I mean the habit of listening. The petitionary aspect of prayer is the most trivial because it is involuntary. We cannot help asking that our wishes may be granted, although all too many of them are like wishing that 2 and 2 may make 5, and cannot and should not be granted. But the serious part of prayer, of meditation, of whatever you want to call it, don't get hung up on the language again, but the serious part of prayer begins when we have got our begging over with and listen for the voice of what I would call the Holy Spirit, although if others prefer to say the voice of Oz or the dreamer, or the conscience, I shan't quarrel, so long as they don't call it the voice of the superego. For that entity can only tell us what we already know, whereas the voice I am talking about always says something new and unpredictable, an unexpected demand, obedience to which involves a change of self, however painful. There are many ways to ecstasy. There are many stages in that trip. And those who undertake it recognize one another, knowing that they have not entered into a stable, settled community, but knowing rather that here is no abiding city, and that in that pilgrimage they have joined a disreputable and foolish band of glorious adventurers. Thank you.